There is a report of varieties of democracy. This report has come out recently, and this report argues that there is a backslide in India's democracy. It argues, this is the 2024 report. This comes at a time when India is actually preparing for the 2024 elections. Things are just getting more exciting when it comes to this election. India's critics are arguing at this point of time that there is, one, deterioration when it comes to freedom of expression. There's a crackdown on media, there's a crackdown on social media. The argument is that civil society in India is under attack, and that stringent sections of law are being applied to silence critics of the government. Is West getting India's democracy wrong? That's the question that I put to our guest this afternoon. Tripurdaman Singh is a scholar, historian, and author. And may I request you to kindly join us on stage, sir? Before he and I talk, may I also invite on stage Asha Motwani Jadeja ji. You're a scholar at the Stanford, you're a philanthropist. I want you to share your thoughts. May I request you to join us on stage and share your thoughts. Is there a decline in India's democracy?
Gaurav, thank you for having me here. I want to bring to your attention something. Here's my answer to what you just asked. Is the Indian democracy in a state of dilution, decline, weakness? Kya ho raha hai, right? I'm going to cite the example of a very dear friend of mine called Professor Walter Russell Mead, who is a scholar at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. Walter is an established, known authority on democracy, political science, geopolitics, and he's also a person who works very closely in foreign policy. He's an advisor to White House. And here is what I heard from Walter. Walter said that a couple of years ago, he didn't know much about India. But then he was told that, this is what's going on, Indian democracy. He tried doing some research, and he discovered that there are lots and lots of voices out there on the internet and in media which are either extremely anti-India, they're extremely pro-India. And he said, what I'm going to do, since I don't know India well, and this I'm talking about the West, let's assume Walter is a reflection of the West. He said, I'm going to pack my bags and visit India. He comes and spends a little bit of time in India, and he discovers that whatever he had read in the media was not only overblown from both sides, but what he didn't realize is that what he discovered is that the democracy not just vibrant, but there is something going on here which is reflected in his meeting with Prime Minister Modi. So Walter goes, Gaurav, to meet the PM and says, how do you think what should I do to gauge the health of Indian democracy? And the Prime Minister said, Aap ek kaam karo, go to Ayodhya and go to Varanasi, which Walter did. What's very interesting is, after plunging into both these cities, he came out with one brilliant insight, that what Modi has pulled off is marrying this fervor that's rising in India, the sort of Hindu nationalism that might be there, with business. He has figured out a way to create profit out of it. He said the kind of profits that Varanasi and Ayodhya alone are generating is something that is, if that is replicated in the rest of India, we are looking at absolutely an act of a genius being pulled off here. It's beginning, it's very imperfect, but it's happening. So my view of that is the West must spend the time to come and see India and understand it better rather than judging it from media. So with that said, not only am I thrilled to have Gaurav, but Tripur is my nephew, so enjoy.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Very kind of you to have joined us and set the stage for this conversation. So, as a scholar, as a historian, as a writer, as an academic, do you think there is a backslide, when we talk about Indian democracy? We're all gearing up for the 2024 elections now.
No, I wrote a piece for the Journal of Democracy last year as well on why the idea of backsliding is a misnomer in the Indian context. First, because it misunderstands the historical context in which Indian democracy was born. It misrepresents the constitutional and institutional structure on which Indian democracy is premised. And it suffers from what I call the Tocqueville effect, or a kind of recency bias. So if you think about backsliding vis-a-vis what, and backsliding from which point to which point. So it's either backsliding from a normative ideal, which is generally taken to be the advanced democracies of Western Europe and North America. India has never been like the advanced democracies of Western Europe and North America. Its foundation addressed a very specific set of circumstances. It faced a very specific set of questions. So Indian democracy is normatively unique. It's a singularity. So a normative comparison with the advanced democracies of the West, where you say each degree of divergence or each spectrum of difference somehow represents a spectrum of inferiority, is, in my mind, like a very strange and unproductive comparison to make.
What was the response to this piece of yours in the academic world in the West or from the society? Was there a pushback?
I mean, academic debate is, of course, part and parcel of the job, but I do know that some people were not very happy with what I'd written. And many people, I think, suspect that it's that it could be seen as an attempt to provide a form of intellectual cover to the current political configuration. Of course, that is not my intention, but interestingly, even when one of my books went for peer review, this was one of the pieces of feedback that came from the reviewers, that I incorporate a paragraph in it saying that it is not the intention of the book to provide any sort of intellectual cover for any future sort of constitutional skullduggery, which I did in the edition that was published in Britain. So, and
this was only for Britain. So you were asked to add a para to your book that it's not meant to help a government.
I wasn't specifically asked to, but the way academic publishing works, you get a series of reports from your academic reviewers, and you address the concerns they raise. And so this was one of the concerns. And since I had to address that concern, this was the primary way that they expected me to address it, which I did. And obviously, the book is not intended to provide intellectual cover for any form of constitutional skullduggery either.
Before we come to your book and talk about specifically about the 16 days, I want you to look at, and I want friends here to look at some of the cartoons that have appeared in newspapers, in the media, in the West. For example, when it came to Mission Mangal, India's Mission Mangal, and there were some cartoons that were printed in the press there. And not just that, when Indian economy was doing very well, they show a snake charmer. And when we talk about India's population, they show an overcrowded train compared to China. Does all of that reflect a certain... So, for example, this is what appeared in a newspaper. Or that India's Mangal mission, Mars mission... Is this reflective of a bias against India?
It's definitely reflective of ignorance, and there's a sense of Orientalist stereotyping that suffuses a lot of commentary and a lot of writing on India, and there's no denying that. Saying that it isn't necessarily bias. Bias comes, would come from a place of knowledge and a place of information. This is outright ignorance, and it's quite common. And I would just flip that again. So part of the question is why the West misunderstands what's happening in India, and the underside of that question is why does India fail to represent and put forward its point in a way that can change the current thinking. So both sides of the question are worth thinking about.
Okay, because one of these cartoons, and all of us who are sitting here, we talk about the International Solar Alliance and India gaining from solar energy, and then a publication puts out poor people eating a solar panel. This cannot really be ignorance. Is this a bias? Is this a pronounced bias?
Yes, and it's drawn very much from ignorance, from an old style, a kind of old style entitlement, which a lot of Orientalist commentary was suffused by, the idea that India was a nation of snake charmers. I mean, if you look at the visual imagery of merchant ivory films, it's very much from that era, and the West, or large parts of the Western commentariat, in a sense, are yet to catch up with the transformation that India has undergone. And this is very, very representative of that. It's in extremely poor taste, and it is very representative of a certain kind of ignorance and a certain kind of Orientalist stereotyping, which suffuses very large parts of the West. I'm not saying that it doesn't represent bias. I'm saying that that bias doesn't necessarily come from a place of hostility, but it definitely comes from a place of profound ignorance.
And when critics say that, look at the judiciary in India, for example, they don't really take on the government, and they almost end up being on the same page as the executive. Do you buy that?
Historically, the judiciary in India has been shy of taking on the government and of having, in a sense, a real fist fight with the executive. I think part of the reason is that the judiciary has been reticent to give judgments that they do not think will meet a certain threshold of social legitimacy. And they're wary of giving judgments which they do not think will be obeyed or they think will be openly flouted. If you look at it historically, I mean, the judiciary has it legitimized the emergency. It ruled that actually even the basic right to life and liberty stood suspended, and they gave a judgment supporting that. And so there is, and part of it is, of course, the judiciary's thinking. Part of it is also by design. India is very much, as I said, we were answering a very unique set of circumstances. So India is by design an executive-heavy democracy, and it is that for a variety of historical reasons. And so the executive is very much placed in the driving seat of the constitutional schemata. So it is not surprising that the judiciary has shied away from challenging the executive beyond a point. What is surprising is actually the extent to which the judiciary has gone. It has actually, through creation of doctrines like the basic structure, actually acquired a degree of power which would be almost unheard of in many other democratic setups.
Okay. When the government talks about a uniform civil code or reforming personal laws, does that smack of majoritarianism, or is the government well within its rights to do so? And the criticism that comes India's way that this is nothing but, again, vote bank politics or rank majoritarianism?
Again, two things. India is majoritarian by design. The reason we chose the first past the post system, which generates where a relatively small percentage of votes can generate very, very large majorities, was designed precisely for this reason, because they saw it as guaranteeing a kind of stability and a kind of unified government at the center, which would otherwise not accrue if you had taken on, say, a adversarial sort of presidential system like the US, or proportional representation as you see in many countries in Europe. So we are majoritarian by design. Again, we have what is often called, and if you look back at perhaps the big dog of constitutional scholars, Granville Austin, we have a constitution that is social revolutionary in nature. It hands to the state vast powers to intervene in the social domain, to regulate social relationships, to legalize social relationships. And that was precisely because India's founding figures, Ambedkar and Nehru, chiefly thought that Indian society lacked the capacity for social reform in and of itself. And that is why not only did the state arm itself with these vast coercive powers, it intervened very heavily in the social domain to reform Hindu laws, to regulate, for example, to open up temples, to have state intervention in temples, which is now a very contentious question, as you know, on the question of caste, and to address the question of caste discrimination. And so if you have that logic driving the constitutional schemata to say that somehow one section of the population can be immune to it or somehow has the capacity for social reform, but X segment of the population doesn't, to my mind smacks of a kind of it smacks of cognitive dissonance if one was to make that claim.
So if you're reforming, let's say, the Hindu laws, you're well within your rights to reform Muslim laws, and that does not rank of majoritarianism or reek of majoritarianism.
No, it doesn't reek of majoritarianism at all. In fact, completely the opposite. In fact, more or less, again, I will give you a historical example by force of habit, nothing else. It is that generally when, say, really consequential steps have been taken, they've been justified by reference to the directive principles of state policy with the idea that these were, in effect, guidelines based on which the governance of the country was to be conducted. And so there was an idea, and it was very much put into the Constitution in the form of a directive principle, that one day we would have universal civil law. And so first, it is not majoritarian, simply because we chose a particular system, we chose it for a reason. And secondly, given that the state is armed with a certain degree of power to intervene in the social domain for a particular reason, for it to use that power for precisely that reason cannot really be termed majoritarianism, in my opinion, at all.
Again, that criticism that comes India's way is on the use of laws on sedition.
Yeah.
You've written extensively on the First Amendment and the manner in which First Amendment was brought in. When you hear this criticism, when you read about this criticism that the government uses stringent sections of the law to silence critics, where do you stand on that?
There's no denying that the sedition law is, and now it's been replaced by another law, which is more or less the same, that the sedition law is open to misuse. But it was always open to misuse. In fact, it was, again, by design, it was designed for misuse. It was designed to suppress Indian nationalists during the Raj era. And so for that reason, it was, my apologies, it was more or less decided that it would be done away with when the Constitution was written up. And as you mentioned, it was brought back via the First Amendment. And the biggest reason why it was opposed by such a wide constellation, and just to give you a tiny nugget of information, among the people that sedition was contemplated against, it was Nehru even contemplated using it against Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, who was then his own cabinet colleague. So it's a law written in necessarily broad terms to serve an executive-heavy agenda. So it's not surprising that it's misused. It is surprising to me that actually those who are subjected to it, when they come into power, decide that it's now well and good. And this is another trend in Indian politics, and you will see it throughout history, is that nobody actually comes up with a concrete proposal to do away with those elements that promote a certain kind of authoritarianism or a certain kind of concentration and amplification of executive power, because everyone wants to use it for their own particular agenda. So everyone opposes sedition when they're in the opposition, and everyone is happy to use it once you're sitting on the chair of government.
There's also a lot of criticism of late that free speech is under tremendous threat in India, and that systems of checks and balances are failing. Whether it's the press, it's the social media that's under attack, stringent sections of law are being used to silence critics. In your appreciation, has anything special been done in the past 10 years, or is that what the system has been like, in our country?
So as I speak about the Tocqueville effect again, part of the reason why there is a lot of, in a sense, brouhaha over free speech now is because you can see a lot more than you could see 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. But arena for free speech in India has always been at the capriciousness of the executive. So India will never be as liberal as it was on 26 January 1950, the day the constitution was enforced. Every constitutional amendment, every legal tool that the government has created after that has only constrained that arena legally and constitutionally over the last 50, 70 odd years. Now you have a situation where someone, the state, has the power to act the way it does, to constrain free speech the way it does, to squeeze that arena whenever it wants. And then it's left to the capriciousness of whoever's sitting in power, the moods, whims, and fancies of whoever's sitting in power to do as they will. And so legally and constitutionally, that arena has always been extremely constrained. It depends on how far the government wants to intervene in that domain, and then to fault a particular government for using the powers that it has been granted for exactly the purposes that it is using them, to my mind, is against brownie point scoring without actually having any sense about how to address that problem. If there is genuinely a problem, someone should come up with a concrete proposal to say, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to undo X, Y, and Z bits of India's constitutional scheme or India's legal structure to prevent that domain from being constrained in the future. But no one does it. And I think that is more important than any commentary on the fact that free speech might be facing a rollback or not. In my eyes, it's basically an oscillation dependent solely and completely on the whims and fancies of whoever sits in the chair of power.
Interesting. And as we gear up for the 2024 elections, this dance of democracy continues. I'm sure all of you are going out to vote. But are we, as some argue, an elected autocracy or a vibrant democracy? That debate continues. Weigh in on that for joining us here on this India Today special. Sir, many thanks.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.